in the past few months at Corona Conversations, we have been constantly discussing about how the lives of different categories of migrants have been affected because of the pandemic, how the mobility has been compromised, etc. We talked about blue collar migrants, white collar migrants, but every time we talk about blue collar migrants, low skilled migrants or unskilled migrants, whatever they're called, our usual imagination is of the global south. How African migrants in China, how Indian migrants in Dubai, or the Pakistani migrants, for example, in the UK, are negotiating with the pandemic. But seldom are we really talking about how the low skilled migrants from Europe, within Europe, are navigating. And that is exactly what we will be doing in this session of Corona Conversations, Mobility in a Post-COVID Future today with Professor Manuela Boatca. It is a real pleasure to invite Professor Manuela Boatca from Ludwig University in Freiburg for this conversation. Professor Boatca is a sociologist and the director of Global Studies Program, the GSP at Freiburg. And one of her very recent articles on the Romanian seasonal migrants in Germany actually got us into thinking as to how important it is to really engage with this discourse of Romanian-German migrant-host society relationship, especially within the context of this coronavirus pandemic. So here we are today. So a very warm welcome to you, Professor Boatca. We are really very excited and very grateful to have you among us today. You and I have been conversing for quite a few years now, but we never really got to meet each other. So finally we do, despite the digital interface, but I'm really, really thankful that you actually accepted the invitation to be at the Corona Conversations today. Before we formally begin, I would like to mention just quickly a few things that I usually do before every session for our participants. So today's session is split between a conversation followed by an open house where the participants are invited to pose their questions or share their comments with Professor Boatca. And regarding the time split, the conversation we think will be around 30 to 40 minutes, and then the open house could be for around 15 to 20 minutes. So altogether, it is going to be around a 50 minutes session or so. And the conversation between Professor Boatca and I are going to be recorded, but the open house will not be recorded. And these conversations are already, some of these conversations are already available at the GSSE website. For future references. So you may not like to record or take pictures of any portion of the conversation, because if you would like, they're all open access available to at the GSSE website. Lastly, regarding interacting with Professor Boatca in the open house, please press the raise your hand button on Zoom and introduce yourself briefly and pose your question or share your comments. And in case there is a technical glitch because of which you're unable to do so, you may then write the question in the chat box, and then Ulrike or I, any of us will take them up. So this is largely the structural specifics regarding the session. And now let us formally begin with the conversation. So Professor Boatca, you have recently written about the Romanian migrants that I just was also mentioning about, the seasonal migrants in Germany, who come every year to grow asparagus for the Germans. And the pandemic, despite all border control, otherwise did not spare that system, that phenomena. In fact, these migrants, they toiled in poor working conditions with a lot of health hazards to grow a food item, which is far from a necessity during a pandemic. So this was last April, and we are approaching another April in a couple of months. So could you tell us their stories as to what happened when they came this time despite the pandemic, and what kind of migrant experiences and pandemic experiences they were subject to?
Yes, thank you so much, Amrita, for the invitation, and thank you to the Center for having this very exciting format that I think is useful to archive some of our experiences that we all want to kind of put behind us, but when they are behind us, we will be happy to have an archive of reflections on them. And I think this focus on mobility and the pandemic is a really important one. So I'm really thankful also that you chose this focus, because as you mentioned, mostly inner European migration is not at the center of our conversations. And in the case of Romanian migrants to Germany, really this became a news item when it became spectacular because somebody died of it. So that was last year in April, when a 57-year-old Romanian harvest worker died from his corona infection on an asparagus farm, really not far from Freiburg here in Bad Krotzingen. That was even before the borders were closed, but that then kind of panned onto a whole history of migrants, seasonal workers who had come in order to pick asparagus and were not protected by their employers, just like that one worker who died had not been adequately protected. We had all of a sudden a lot of news coverage of Romanian laborers, some of them even from the same enterprise, the same farm, who reported that they were sharing a room with several other people, that they had not been tested or isolated, that they had to use the same masks for several days. They hadn't been tested despite exhibiting symptoms at some point. And in time, there were ever more cases. Now, the scandal was not so much that isolated cases could be brought to light, but the scandal was that in the larger context of seasonal workers coming to Germany, according to EU legislation, so Romania is a EU country, workers are entitled to what is called in official language equal treatment with nationals of the host country in terms of access to employment, training, trade unions, housing, and social and tax advantages. So that meant that officially they should receive the German minimum wage, at the time was 9.35 euros per hour. It's a bit higher in 2021. But from that minimum wage were deducted not only the fees paid to agencies that placed them as workers in Germany, but also some, or in some cases, all of their travel expenses, as well as 8 euros a day for accommodation, 4 euros a day for lunch. In very similar cases, very actually big sums related to what they were supposed to gain. That is a kind of list of maybe details in the larger context of creating exceptions to what was already a state of exception. So when the borders were closed, new regulations had to be found, apparently had to be found, because as you mentioned, asparagus is not a necessity item, but it was declared an important enough commodity to put new regulations in place for. So all of a sudden, the regulation that said that seasonal workers can be employed in Germany for 70 days without their employers paying Social Security were extended by the Federal Interior Minister and the Agriculture Minister, Julia Klöckner, to say, well, they can be employed up to 115 days without Social Security, meaning they do not have health coverage in a pandemic. So not only are they not protected in the sector that is mostly vulnerable or most vulnerable at the point in which this regulation is put in place, but they had to travel on charter flights to avoid the risk of infection during bus journeys throughout Europe. The employment contract said that their working hours may be extended by up to 50% over the legal maximum of 8 hours. Working Sundays, public holidays was allowed if deemed necessary. So all of the regulations were to the benefit of the employers and extending all possibilities on the side of making the workers more vulnerable. This was already in April kind of valid for up to 80,000 workers that were supposed to enter Germany only in April and May, without it being clear how they would maybe return, because at the time, airlines could still kind of voice their own conditions and regulations, and they required that if somebody flies back while nobody was flying, entire aircrafts had to be chartered with at least 150 seats. So one person or two persons could not decide, well, okay, this is untenable, I'm flying back, because there was nothing to fly in. And so all these kinds of exceptional regulations made it possible to have an entire structure of abuse that was not, so to say, the structure in which this was supposed to take place. Of course, I'm not relating an intent of abuse, but only the possibility of opening the door to a lot of discrimination, abuse, and vulnerability, which is what happened. And yeah,
Right.
maybe from the seasonal workers, this went on. If I, yeah.
No, please continue.
Because that was the initial scandal, right? The asparagus field and the asparagus crop, which was supposed to be kind of the one exception. But then, of course, the time for other crops came. And so those who had come to pick asparagus went on to pick strawberries. Then France kind of signaled that it would be important for the wine harvest. Then the UK signaled that it would be important for other harvests. So there were all sorts of continuations, soft and not so soft continuations of the same very flexible legal regulations. And then the next hotspots that were also very visible in Germany were the ones in meat processing plants that also became huge news items, not because they were employing seasonal workers, because in that case they were employing migrant workers that had been in Germany for some time, but nevertheless could be treated differently on account of a different citizenship, of a different kind of system of protection that was on the burden, that was the burden of the Romanian state, so to say, for them being citizens, and that they were subjected to different kind of labor conditions that, as it was soon realized, was very conducive to corona infections because of the meat processing plant having a cool environment, a lot of people working close together, and so the virus could spread more easily, but there was no provision made for it. So the most prominent was the Tönnies scandal. Well, actually the several scandals around the Tönnies company. That also has a lot of interests in and has bought land in Romania. So the connections there are not coincidental, but are very systematic and go back a long time.
Right. Interestingly, as you say, that although the EU legislation delineates that migrants will have equal employment contracts and etc. as compared to the native workers, but in practice that is not the case, as you pointed out. Now, I'm just wondering, why is that? One possibility that I'm just thinking aloud, is that the difference between German Gesellschaft and Gemeinschaft, the dichotomy, that the outsider-insider debate, and how national identity, even at the face of a pandemic, could easily override the need to lower the risk of these blue-collar migrants and their precarious working conditions. Now, from that standpoint, where do you locate the sentiments of Germanism or Deutschtum, as they call it, within this discourse? And do you think that the sentiment, which often extends to an anti-immigrant sentiment also, has intensified during this pandemic?
Well, that's very interesting that you mentioned the dichotomy Gemeinschaft und Gesellschaft by Ferdinand Tönnies. That's a different Tönnies than the one we were just talking about.
Not this one.
But it's a very smooth transition to kind of sociological vocabulary. I think maybe more than that dichotomy that Ferdinand Tönnies thought between Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, that were supposed to be different stages of social evolution. The Weberian explanation with the sentiment of Germanism is maybe even more to the point here, because the fact is that the working conditions under which Eastern European workers have been employed in Western Europe are not only systematically bad, but they also have a long history. And so this is not unprecedented. This is something that we've seen for quite some time. And this is something that Max Weber actually wrote about. And as we know from history, already during the industrialization in the German Reich, this seasonal agricultural work had become increasingly unattractive for the domestic population in Germany. So that's when migration started, and industrial centers such as the Ruhr area attracted hundreds of thousands of workers and their families, not only German workers, but increasingly also the recruitment of especially Polish workers on large estates east of the Elbe became increasingly profitable. So industrial centers were employing German workers, whereas then large estates for agricultural work started being reserved to Eastern European agricultural workers. And here's where Max Weber comes in. He was looking at the growing importance of what was comparatively inexpensive Polish labor on large country estates at the end of the 19th century, so 1895. And although Polish peasants had German citizenship at the time, Weber described the situation as an economic struggle between nationalities. And for him, it was the desire to protect Germanism, Deutschtum in the original, the Germanism of the East, so that led Weber to defend German standards of value against international standards of social justice. So the fact that the value of Germanism, the value of German agricultural labor and the standards that German farmers had in working the land was for Weber an argument against socialism. That's how he saw the basically international standards of social justice as being a form of socialism. But he saw also the desire to protect Germanism as emanating from political economy. So he said that the science of economic policy, so in Germany it was Volkswirtschaftspolitik, is a political science, a servant of politics, not the day-to-day politics of individuals and classes who happen to be ruling at a particular time, but the lasting power political interests of the nation. Now, these kinds of writing by Weber have been kind of discounted as not representative of his work and so on and so forth, but he was coming back to the idea of the power political interest, machtpolitische Interessen der Nation, time and again, even later in his work, late in his life. So I think here we can draw a nice parallel between what we could call the political economy of asparagus consumption, right? That promotes an economic struggle between nationalities instead or without calling for social justice. Because what we've seen during the at least first wave of the crisis was a German economic policy and French economic policy and UK economic policy in which the same power political interests of the nation were enforced that Weber was conjuring up 100 years ago. So a struggle between nationalities, the protection of rights of Eastern European workers are pitted against safeguarding consumption habits of Western European populations. And we've seen that become very quickly a very national response, a very nationalistic solution. So to answer your question about the sentiment, whether or not anti-migrant sentiment has intensified during the pandemic, I don't think that as such it had undergone a transformation as an anti-immigrant sentiment, but it became more visible. And that's particularly due to the fact that the reaction to the first wave, so the policy reaction mostly, was a retreat into the national space up to closing borders. So forget the idea of the European Union, European community, about free movement. Now, this retreat into national space is not necessarily the same as nationalism, but it does become closely aligned with nationalism if, like I said in the beginning, exceptions are created to what is already a state of exception in a national society. only that the exception means less protection for those who are seen as outside the national body. And all of a sudden, then the idea of the European Union and European citizenship crumbles, because it doesn't help you at all if what you are being reduced to is being outside the national body rather than being part of a European polity. So that increases not only the vulnerability of those who are affected, but also their visibility as outsiders. That's why they were even in the focus so much, because all of a sudden they were visible.
Right. Right, as you point out, the question of vulnerability and how it is close to, closely linked to the question of visibility. Now, drawing from this very context of differential visibility, here is my next question. So Germany is a country that has accepted highest number of blue card holders over the last 5-6 years, and they're still continuing to do so. The percentage of Indians and the Chinese population emigrating to Germany for technical high-skilled jobs and for higher education has increased really significantly over the years. So on the one hand, Germany is open to the high-skilled immigrants from the global south to work and live in the country for long, but not really ready to offer suitable working conditions to the low-skilled immigrants from East European countries. Now, how would you like to respond to this dichotomous approach towards migrants within the larger context of social inequality? And do you think that the pandemic kind of specifically informs these inequalities in any form, or they're just another lens to explore the usual suspects of social disjunctures?
Yeah, I think you point to a very important distinction here. I wouldn't necessarily say it's only high-skilled immigrants from the global south that are welcome and low-skilled immigrants from Eastern Europe who are not welcome. Rather, I think the cleavage is between high-skilled and low-skilled from wherever versus, on the one hand, also wealthy and poor migrants, also from wherever. It does, of course, mean something else, whether we're talking about immigrants from the US or from the global south or from Eastern Europe. But I would say that's not the main cleavage there. And at the same time, none of these differentiations as such, or maybe what we could call the double standard of immigration policy here, is unique to Germany. But indeed, it becomes very visible here, and I think that's what you're very clearly reacting to. One of the reasons why it's very visible here is because Germany has for a long time not considered itself a country of immigration. And when it has started revising this position, it was very reluctant to do so. So among other things, it was revised by targeting high-skilled migrants with a specific working visa for IT specialists, for instance. So in a way, it was trying to be a country of immigration after all, but one that picks and chooses. And other countries do that as well, because this double standard of migration policies is basically standard practice in an unequal world system that is premised on capital accumulation. It's not about welcoming or not welcoming migrants, is how much money you can make off of them, and how much it will cost you to have them kind of be permanent part of your national body and take kind of part and have the possibility to access infrastructure and a welfare state and so on and so forth. But what we have then is that on the one hand, investors and high-skilled migrants receive favorable treatment or are even explicitly invited, while labor migrants face hurdles, sanction, or even up to criminalization, racialization, and so on. And I think it's telling that we even see this in the very language that is used to designate wealthy or high-skilled migrants as opposed to poor or low-skilled ones, or refugees. Because normally the ultra rich, the wealthy investors that are very globally mobile, very seldom self-describe as migrants. We call them, and they call themselves, global investors, expats, or with an official language, foreign residents for tax purposes. We call students international students, without considering the migration part of the process, because the migration language is reserved for labor migrants unless we qualify the process to mean high-skilled migration. But the very fact that we qualify it means that, well, actually it's something else, but the high skill, this is the desirable. And migration processes of wealthy migrants, of investors, is more often referred to as relocation, or also qualified as business migration. And what we see is that on the one hand, visa requirements for the majority, the overwhelming majority of the world's migrants become more restricted, and the passage, the migration more deadly, while there are such things as investor citizenships and visas, residence programs, golden visa programs, and so on and so forth, not only in Europe, but also in places in the global south that have better kind of travel regimes. So with passports that allow you to be more globally mobile worldwide. At the same time, what we see for labor migrants, I prefer the term labor migrants to blue-collar migrants, is that inherited citizenship, so the citizenship that you're ascribed at birth, and in the case you can choose another one, it's a lengthy naturalization process, are legally reinforced as the only legitimate options. Migration as a way of accessing a better kind of welfare system or infrastructure or education system is not seen as legitimate. And in many cases, it legitimizes the political decisions within such supranational bodies as the European Union. For instance, the fears of streams of migrants from Eastern Europe was the reason for delaying or then later vetoing the access of more countries to the Schengen zone. And that brings us back to the Romanian example, because France, for instance, was very concerned with Moldovan migrants coming into the European Union through Romania. So Moldova and Romania share a border, and actually many segments of the population, there's a long history behind that, but Moldova is not a EU member while Romania is. And so that was the reason for France to be the first in line of many Western European states, Germany among others, to argue against Romania and Bulgaria joining the Schengen zone. And even in 2013, the then German Minister of the Interior, Hans-Peter Friedrich, said that the attempt to join will fail because of a German veto if Romania and Bulgaria did not prevent migrants from abusing the system. And up to today, Romania and Bulgaria do not have access to the Schengen zone. It's being negotiated for Bulgaria, and it seems there will be some form of arrangement there, but it's not there yet, and it's been very much longer than in many other cases. Now, at the same time, through Romania and Bulgaria becoming part of the Schengen zone, there would be a land access from North Africa into the European Union through Greece, which is currently not possible. With Romania and Bulgaria not being part of the Schengen zone, that access is not possible. So it's not so much about other or Eastern European migrants, it's also about access of refugees to the European Union territory. And maybe the last point, when we talk about low-skilled migrants, I think we run the risk of inviting more negative stereotypes. And we have seen this happening also in the case of Romanian migrants. While low-skilled, especially low-skilled agricultural work is not only stereotypically associated with physical strength, but invites kind of racist stereotypes as well. In the case of the UK press coverage of Eastern Europeans coming in to the UK as seasonal workers, the argument was very explicitly and really unabashedly that Eastern Europeans are more used to backbreaking work, and Britons can perform that. So that's why they're adequate to perform this work, and that's why they're actually desirable, which, if we take a global historical perspective, this is a stark reminder of racist tropes of plantation workers being better fitted for physical work because they're closer to nature and the animal reign. And a lot of that can be seen actually to this day in the discourse on East versus West, and kind of the civilized versus the rather primitive, we could actually exacerbate the dichotomy to that extent, rather primitive Eastern European worker.
Right. So from what I understand is that racial stereotypes are definitely one premise for the countries of immigration. For example, Germany or UK, whatever you're calling, to rationalize the immigration policies, and for blue collar migrants especially. So at the moment, I'm trying to shift the focus from Germany to Romania and the migrants that we are talking about. So Romania per se, Romania has very high rate of poverty, and it already puts its population, at a very high risk, health hazard, and concomitant issues and challenges. Now, I'm just inquisitive, how does a poverty-stricken country survive the pandemic, and what are the structural obligations, structural desperations for the people there to emigrate to Western Europe during the harvest season, even amidst the coronavirus pandemic? So what is there from that side of the picture? How was the desperation, and what was the structural crisis?
Right. So, yeah, thank you for this very clear refocus. I think it's important to point it out. So most of the seasonal laborers who work in Germany's fields, at least, come from Romania. And indeed, Romania has the highest share of a population at risk of poverty in the entire European Union. So it is not uncommon for Romanians to live and work abroad. Actually, more than 20% of Romanians live and work abroad. But that is not the equivalent of having migrated, because then seasonal labor is an alternative to permanently migrating, which is why it's interesting. Also because a lot of people going into seasonal labor are not agriculturalists, they're not farmers in their day-to-day work. Some of them have very different professions. Some of them are engineers, some of them are, or used to be, in the medical profession. Some of them are teachers. But the stark difference, both in minimum wage and kind of any kind of remuneration that you can get in Germany as opposed to Romania, even with the deductions from the minimum wage that were practiced during the pandemic, are still a gain with respect to, or in contrast with, what it would be possible to do in Romania. And also because of this high rate of migration of Romanians and high rate of seasonal migration to Western Europe, when the pandemic came and borders were closed, the Romanian government had to basically admit that it had no structure to actually support this population, because a lot of the seasonal workers were either working undocumentedly in Western Europe, or if they worked legally, there was no alternative for them to be employed in Romania alternatively. So the Romanian government conceded to the agreement, or accepted the agreement that Germany offered, well knowing that it would expose Romanian workers. At the time in Romania, there was a very strict lockdown with military in the streets, fining everyone who didn't have the written declaration of why they left the house. But at the same time, whole kind of hundreds and thousands of labor migrants went to Germany, crammed in buses and planes to be able to work there in the fields unprotected. So basically that was a declaration of failure on the part of the Romanian government, basically saying if at least what we have left is the right to free movement within the European Union, then during the pandemic, we will accept the kind of worse conditions of the contract, despite the lack of health insurance. And so that, of course, is a vicious circle that exposes the workers to higher risks, and it exposes the population in Romania to a different extent, because, of course, these people went back. And at the moment, you didn't know where the situation would be worse. If they went back infected, then it was the burden of the Romanian state and of the Romanian health system to take care of them. But there comes maybe the more important component of that. 1/3 of Romania's medical professionals work abroad, and very many of them work in Germany. So actually, the people who would have needed to take care of those coming back from having worked in Germany were also in Germany, Romania's medical professionals. So it is a vicious circles in more than one way.
Right. So within this larger question of poverty, this vicious cycle of poverty, this multi-layer, like a network of challenges, which only intensifies during a pandemic, of course, like COVID-19. But how do you envisage the future of the Romanian migrants in Western Europe, especially those who are going to seek, or those who are already seeking refugee status in a post-pandemic situation? And also then we have UK and Brexit. So the entire EU has gone through a lot of transformation. How do you see the future of the Romanian migrants in Western Europe in that context?
Not very well, to kind of anticipate the answer or the conclusion to that. With regard to Brexit, it was explicitly a decision directed against Eastern European migrant workers in the UK, not only Romanian and Bulgarians, but also Polish workers. And we already see a tightening of conditions for all Eastern European workers in post-Brexit Britain, because very recently, I think just last week, the UK government has increased the number of visas that it will issue to seasonal agricultural workers, because as you pointed out, the harvest season is coming again. But the visas come at a high price, because Romanians, Bulgarians, Estonians, Lithuanians, and Slovenians will pay more for them than other EU citizens, 244 pounds. It doesn't sound like much, but actually the UK could reduce the cost of this visa to less than 200 pounds, but it chooses not to. And on top of that, applicants will need a certificate of sponsorship from a UK employer and will need to prove that they have enough money to support themselves in the UK, which means at least 1,270 UK pounds, which for many means that they will just not be able to prove that, especially also because the proof must be in the form of bank statements. So if you don't have a bank account, then the whole discussion is pointless. And not to focus it too much on the UK, I think for the rest of Western Europe, the future would mean less bargaining power for not only Romanian, but also other Eastern European workers after the pandemic, because what we've seen in all wakes of life, really, but also for labor migrants or labor seasonal migrants, was that the pandemic has exacerbated all existing inequalities rather than creating a structure of redistribution. So what we would think would have been the workers' bargaining power during a pandemic where borders were closed, where you could have expected seasonal workers to say, well, if you want me to risk my life and come work for you, then you should pay me more. The attitude was reversed. You depend on us to have any work at all, so you can work in conditions that you never would have accepted. Now, this has not gone away. The borders might not be closed right now, but we don't know, maybe they still could be. But the lessening of bargaining power has remained, because all economies that were not doing well are doing less well, and those that were doing well have not started recovering yet. So the pressure will be on those who have no alternative and no bargaining power there. So I'm afraid I'm pessimistic on that account, unless something radical happens. And radical, I mean, of course, in a good way. And I don't see that happening right now, including in Romania, where a fascist party has entered parliament in December.
Right. Yeah, so thank you, Professor Boatca. As you point out that from what I can understand, that on one hand, there is a Brexit. Then on the other hand, we have a pandemic and then a post-pandemic situation where, you know, the economy and all current social inequalities, of course, are going to get only pronounced and more complicated. Uh, what struck me the most in this conversation so far is that how in common parlance and often even at policy levels, we presume that blue collar or that is, you know, like low skilled, as they are categorized as the low skilled migrants, they do not really deserve social worth or recognition. Now, this is because from what I understand, the parameter that we refer to for differentiating low and high skilled migrants is formal education required to get a job. Now, while it is true that low-skilled migrants lack that formal education, but by reducing their worth, both economic and social worth, to only this one parameter, I think we dismiss the technical, physical, and emotional skills that these migrants have, which are also equally, sometimes even more crucial for carrying out their jobs very meticulously. For example, like for you know, like harvesting asparagus or berries, or you know, this stuff, or the nursing care, this kind of job. So there are capabilities and skills that are learned on the job. The experiences gathered while being employed already are not considered very seriously in that case. Now, formally, we define these blue collar migrants with reference to, in that case, an absence, you know, of education, formal affiliations, etc. While in reality, blue collar or low skill basically means low pay, precarious work conditions, and overrepresentation of these migrants in certain particular sectors. So be it the Romanian seasonal migrants in Germany or the Thai migrants in Sweden for picking berries, pictures are pretty similar. For example, the entire tourism industry in Italy, you know, it's based on the labor of blue collar migrants from outside the EU. And unlike Sweden or Germany, these migrants enter Italy for other purposes, but finally they end up working in the tourism sector over there. So in most of these cases, none of these migrants have health insurances, as you rightly pointed out, even during COVID-19, even during a pandemic. And this is very significant because it is a global health crisis, and you know, lives have already been lost. And only then the focus started moving to their plight after, you know, lives were lost. So the countries in Western Europe, on the other hand, they haven't really failed to the countries that we are talking about. They, however, haven't really failed to address the situation of their own people, but have blindsided the low-skilled migrants from, you know, several other countries, including Eastern Europe, which are far less wealthy in comparison to the Western Europe. Now, so from that standpoint, although it is a question of how national identity and anti-migrant sentiments work, which are basically, in my opinion, mirror images of each other, and how they construct the imagination of public health sovereignty in a country, for example, like Germany. It is also, as you rightly point out, ultimately a question of capital accumulation than anything else. Now, having said that, capital accumulation and national pride, in my opinion, are not really mutually exclusive, because even the wealthy nations of the West are now increasingly, you know, they have the demand for labor migration from outside because of aging population and low birth rate in their own countries, etc. Now, another thing, and which is the last thing, I will just quickly mention, and then I'll stop, and then we can open the house and we can discuss further, is something very interesting I observed in Eurostat, like the database we usually, where we find all the migration statistics of Europe. And the Eurostat, it doesn't keep any data on seasonal migration to Germany from Romania. Now, this is because unlike Sweden, Italy, and the UK, which receives blue collar migrants from outside the EU, Romania is a part of the European Union. Now, talking about the vulnerability and invisibility of the Romanian seasonal migrants in Germany, which we did already, I think the invisibility starts from this very space, or where there is a systematic de-recognition of blue-collar migrants from within the EU member states that may navigate across the European Union. And it is this invisibility that kind of intensifies the vulnerability of these migrants during a pandemic like COVID-19, because when the pandemic broke and these migrants who maybe could continue working even without a health insurance in a non-COVID situation, but now have fallen sick and some of them have died when infected with the coronavirus. So this is where the intersection of the social inequality and the coronavirus pandemic, I think, impacts the lives of the blue collar migrants, and especially in this context, the seasonal migrants from Romania to Germany. Now, with this, I would like to stop now at the moment and then open the house, not really stop, but just open the house and include our participants and invite our listeners to participate in the conversation. So we are just expanding the scope of the conversation to include all of us, and then we can maybe continue with my reflections if you would like to respond, or we can start taking questions from our participants.